Well, hi everyone, and welcome to Race and Conversations about Race in America webcast. I'm Dr. Rob Shelby, Chief Diversity Officer at the University of Evansville. And I thought I'd start us off by just a brief recap about why we're doing this and what's going on. So we're living in unprecedented times with social impacts from COVID-19, the deaths of Ahmaud Arbery in February of 2020, Breonna Taylor in March, and George Floyd in May. There have been calls for reforms to policing and criminal justice. There have been subsequent lynchings, high suicide rates, voter access issues for individual states during the primaries, and some voter concerns as we lead up to the presidential election. We've seen the removal of Confederate statues and flags, the emergence of social movements, and so much more. These topics all have a race dimension that are of significant concern for many of our students, employees, and the greater Evansville community. The summer portion of the series is scheduled for Wednesdays at 1 o'clock, with a final summer session taking place on August the 5th. Each session will consist of a 1-hour discussion with a UE community member about race and its relationship to and impact on various topics. So before we start, as I usually do at the early part of this, I'd like to give a few housekeeping details. So during today's conversation, you're encouraged to ask questions using the Q&A feature. You'll also notice at the bottom of your screen, the chat feature is enabled. And the way that we just like to use these somewhat differently is if you have a question, to go ahead and ask it there. We like to address those questions before we finish our time together. In the chat, use more for comments. So if you have comments that you would like to make, and of course, if you forget any of that, you can put questions or comments in either one of those, and we will roll with it. So your questions can be asked anonymously, and that's one of the advantages of using the Q&A feature. You can put your question in there anonymously if you so prefer. And the plan is to address as many questions as we can before we get off the call, before we finish, of course. So this week, our guest is Dr. Valerie Stein. Valerie Stein is a professor of religious studies, chair of the Department of Philosophy and Religion, and program director for race and ethnicity studies at the University of Evansville. Valerie earned her ThD in Hebrew Bible and Old Testament from Harvard University. She has been at the University of Evansville since 2002. Her primary research interest has centered around the history of biblical interpretation, particularly examining the ways in which the biblical text has functioned to marginalize or oppress certain groups. She has presented and published about the Bible's use, its influence, and its impact around the issues of gender, Jewish-Christian relations, colonialism, and race. In her teaching, she explores the intersection of religion and culture in the context of social diversity. She seeks to help her students develop intellectual empathy as a tool for critically engaging religion as a structural force that produces inequality. Her courses include Religion in America, Bible and Justice, Religion, Gender and Culture, Religious Ethics, Social Justice Movements, and Race and Religion. Welcome, Dr. Stein.
Thank you. Good to be here.
I would also like to introduce Leora Carter. You can see her on the screen there. She is a recent high school graduate from Providence Cristo Rey High School in Indianapolis, Indiana. And she's joining us this fall at the University of Evansville as a biochemistry major and a member of the Fellows Scholars Program. I'm thrilled because Leora is already establishing herself as an involved and responsible student before ever taking a class at the University of Evansville. So welcome, Leora.
Thank you.
So I thought we could get started. We could start anywhere, of course, because it's a conversation, but I kind of gave this this in the introduction, talking about the types of courses that you teach. Kind of introduce us to what you're trying to do in those particular courses, and of course, the big question: why does it even matter that we consider this topic, religion and race? Why do we care?
Sure. I think we care because religion plays such an important role in our society. If we look at the percentage of Americans who are religious, it is a vast majority of Americans, even though the numbers have shifted in recent years. And a lot of people get their understanding of kind of their place in the world, their sense of values through religious communities. So those communities are really playing a significant role in shaping how people understand and respond to what's going on in the world.
So how does that then connect to, I often say, boy, what a messy thing to wade into. You know, two topics that people typically don't want to talk about in good company, so to speak, right? We don't typically like to talk about religion, and we typically don't like to talk about race, because there is this, it's not just about the topics themselves, it's about perhaps the values and the beliefs that we carry, which we don't always want to share with people outside of those who are, you know, a part of our close-knit relationships. So why have you chosen to kind of wade into that?
You know, ever since I started teaching in the area of religion, I've always been wanting to pay attention to that so what question. If this is the one class, you know, that I'm teaching at any given moment that a student ever has in the academic study of religion, what are they going to take away from that? And sure, you want them to understand something about the tradition, you know, whatever the topic might be, you want them to kind of get that basic information. But more importantly, I think from my perspective, I want them to be able to critically respond to however that is playing out in the world. So if they see something in the news with respect to religion, it's not just a knee-jerk reaction. It's not just, oh, I think this way because my family thinks this way, or because my church told me to think this way, or whatever my community is, but that there's a deeper level of analysis that one is able to do because you understand these things a little bit more in context. But you're right, these are hard things to talk about. There usually are racial and religious identities are sort of at the core of who we are. They really shape the lens through which we see the world. And so I think a couple of things are happening when you study them or have to talk about them. One is that you worry about saying the wrong thing. And we're afraid that people are going to get mad at us, or that people are going to judge us for our perspective. And I think we also are worried about being challenged and having to think about these things differently, and that's hard. So I usually say, you know, at the beginning of my classes, especially something like race and religion, hey, we're going to talk about these two really challenging topics, and it is hard, and it is going to be uncomfortable. But, you know, when we let ourselves sort of explore that area of discomfort, that's where the tension is. That's really where the learning can happen, where we can start to see things differently. And that's what we should want in college, to see things differently. We didn't come to just confirm everything we already thought. We could stay home and do that. We come to see the world in a different way, to think about different perspectives. But that can be a hard place to go.
So walk us through that a little bit. So what is it like for, you know what you're trying to do with your students, and they may not be as prepared for that, especially if they're coming directly out of high school or have been at a university for any length of time. Walk us through what that process is like. So yes, it's scary. You introduce them to, I guess, trying to prepare them for the journey that they're embarking on, so to speak, right? Mm-hmm. How do you go about doing that? And let's choose maybe one of your classes. I suspect it'll be something like race and religion.
Okay.
Kind of walk us through what that process is like. And then what I want to do is maybe unpack some of the the material that you actually cover in that class. So maybe
Sure.
like race and religion in America, like the historical perspective in less than 50 minutes.
Yeah. I mean, one of the ways we do it is I start by talking about what I've kind of talked about already. I acknowledge that this is hard.
Mm.
And I think it's important that we talk about the fact that it's going to be hard and that we're going to be uncomfortable. So, and coming back to that frequently throughout the class and recognizing that their ideas are going to be challenged, and, talking about that as something that is potentially a very good thing, because it means that they're coming to see things in different ways. And I also say, the point isn't, it is, but I'll say the point isn't to change their mind or to make them, it's not to make them think a certain way, let's put it that way, right? I'm not getting them to think this thought here, but I want them to think about those different perspectives.
Can we pause there for a moment? Because you're bringing up a very important distinction that I think needs to be addressed. Perhaps in a future session, we'll talk about this with some folks. But you just talked about kind of the role or the purpose behind higher education. As I've heard, even in circles that I'm a part of, where the concern about what's happening in higher education is that, you've got professors who have lots of control over what happens in the classroom. We call it academic freedom. They say, others say control. I don't want to say us and them. Some may consider that control, and control in a negative sense. And what the concern is that the professor then attempts to indoctrinate the students to their way of thinking. It doesn't sound like that's your approach, though. Can you speak to that before we kind of move on?
Sure. I mean, I've got some pretty strong views, no doubt about that, but I'm not out to create little bees that look at the world exactly the same way that I do. What I do want is for the students to examine these different ways of thinking, and to then be able to kind of, when we encounter some of these controversial issues, I'll say that you might have the exact same opinion after we talk about it that you do right now. But it should be more informed. You should understand a little bit more of why you think that. You should be a little bit more, you should have a better sense of where some of those assumptions, what assumptions you do have going into it, where you're being influenced by some different trajectories of thought, for example, or something like that. So the idea is not necessarily to not get you to think a particular way, but to think about why you think the way you do. And maybe, and probably often along the way, people do change the way they think about things. And that's okay too. I mean, I hope I keep, looking at my views and being open to changing them. That's part of what it means to be alive.
Right.
From my perspective, right? I don't give an excuse to somebody who's 80 years old to not be able to think about something differently. Okay.
Yes. Thank you for sharing that. I'll say this too. I think that's one of the things that attracted me to higher education. I didn't feel as if, even as a student, I mean, because it takes a while to earn one's PhD or THD or, any degree, right? It does take time. And recognizing that a part of that journey is that you will be engaging ideas from a myriad of perspectives. And what I've tried to model, and this is part of the reason why I think you and I click so well, is that that the goal here is to really present or provide an opportunity for our students to interact with the material. And I'm saying interact for the topics we're talking about. Many times what they're doing is they're wrestling through the material.
Sure.
And I am completely comfortable with getting to the end of a semester and a student really feeling like they are more confused than they were when they started. I find that to be completely invigorating, because what it's telling me is is that they're really wading into the work, because there are no easy answers to what it is we're talking about.
Sure, and I often say in my class, my hope is that we complicate your understanding of these issues.
Yes.
Not that you walk out with a nice package tied up of what to think about it, but that you understand sort of the complexity, and that you have lots of questions that you're going to be wrestling with for quite a while.
Yes. I would even say for a lifetime.
Yes.
Right. So yeah, let's pick up then and jump back into thinking about or walking us through what happens in, say, some of the content, where I'm hoping that many of our guests will start to wade in with some comments and some questions for us to address. When you and I talk, we're often talking about, the history of race and religion in this country, the systems that have been built to support it. Walk us through what that's kind of like.
One of the things that, like a race and religion class, what I would usually start with to kind of introduce the class after we've talked about it a little bit is something contemporary that highlights where we see this intersection of race and religion. So let's start with something, and it's usually something a little bit controversial, because that gets us kind of seeing, we can dig in a little bit, we can see that those emotions playing out, and that we've got all these different perspectives. So this fall, I haven't really started on my race and religion class yet. However, there's been a lot happening in the news that certainly is presenting itself as possible material for that first day or two, as far as what we would be looking at. So I would probably pick something like, when was it, in early June, where Donald Trump had the protesters cleared out from Lafayette Park and walked across to the Episcopal Church there and held up the Bible. And of course, that is in the context of the racial tension that we have currently going on, right? So he's responding to a particular incident, and he's basically making kind of a law and order claim against the racial protests that are going on. So it's this real example of where race and religion are intersecting, and we see both sides of it. So for example, he's using religion to stake a claim kind of against those protesters, but at the same time you have actual clergy people from that church who were out there with the protesters, right? So there's not like one way that race and religion line up. If we look at the history of race and religion in America, it's an extremely complicated relationship where religion is functioning in many different ways. Sometimes on the side of racial justice and really advocating and working for that, and sometimes on the side of really upholding white supremacy and those attitudes. You want me to say more about that?
Oh yes. Oh yes. How about some examples about how religion has, and I guess maybe to clarify a bit too, your expertise is in the Judeo-Christian tradition, right?
Right.
And maybe talk through a little bit of perhaps examples of how both sides, how both of those things have played a part in American history. And I love talking about thinking about the Abrahamic faiths a bit more, as a group too. So thinking about how that might play out with Judaism, how that might play out with Islam.
Sure.
Because there are some differences there in the way in which, while there's still certainly some intersections, but the intersections are somewhat different, right? And so, yeah, let's start with the Judeo-Christian tradition, or the Christian tradition, and then kind of roll that through.
Sure, and one of the things that I also talk about in my class is that even though I said it's complicated, and we have religion playing a role both in fighting for justice and upholding white supremacy, but I think it's fair to say that for a lot of white students, it's very uncomfortable because they're seeing a Christianity that maybe they're familiar with some new light shed on it that maybe makes them a little uncomfortable, and they're feeling that it's being attacked. But I try to make the point that we're looking at sort of a range of the ways this plays out. Another part of the problem is most of them don't really know this history. And so that can be kind of painful to realize that there's so much of this that they were never aware of before. And it makes them think differently.
Yes.
But if you go back to slavery in this country, slaves that were brought over from Africa, their own culture was sort of taken from them, and Christianity was really imposed on them, although there was kind of a debate as to whether or not slaves should be converted to Christianity, because the slave owners were kind of worried that if they did, that might mean they would have to free them or treat them differently or something like that. But they kind of worked through that and decided, yes, they should convert the slaves, and they should treat them nicely and teach them about Christianity, but they didn't have to stop having them as slaves. But Christianity was really used to uphold the whole system of slavery. Now, most Christians, I would imagine, would say, oh, slavery is a bad thing. Of course it's a bad thing. Go back to the 19th century, there wasn't an obvious position on this with respect to slavery.
Right.
Most of the slave owners in the South were church-going Christians. And most church-going Christians in the South supported the institution of slavery. And slavery was used, so an example of how it was used to uphold the system, catechisms are little teachings of how to, what you should believe as a Christian, right? So it's a way of teaching Christianity. So there used to be these little slave catechisms that were meant to teach the slaves about Christianity, but also to uphold slavery. So for example, it would say something like, and it was usually kind of a question or a call and response kind of thing. So who created the world? God created the world. Who keeps you safe from snakes? God keeps me safe from snakes. Who created your master and your mistress? And who are you supposed, who's kind of acting on God's behalf, to keep you safe? And of course the answer was the slaveholder, right? So these catechisms, it's kind of built into how they're teaching Christianity that that upholds that system. One of my favorite stories about how this worked out, Howard Thurman, who was a theologian, civil rights activist, he was the dean of chapel at Howard University for a time. His grandmother had been a slave. And when he was a boy, it was his job to read her the Bible. She was a devout Christian. But she would never let him read the epistles that are associated with Paul. Because, she said, those books of the Bible were read by the slave owners to keep slaves in their places. So passages like slaves obey your master, right, even if they treat you harshly, like 1 Peter or something like that. Yes. So, we see that Christianity was clearly used to uphold slavery. There are countless biblical verses that assume slavery, that basically say God ordained slavery. We could look at a whole list of this, and we do this sometimes in my class. I'll print out, page after page of biblical passages that say, oh, here's how you should treat your slaves, right? So the assumption is that slavery is okay. The Bible even tells you how to take care of your slaves. So it's an easy argument to make that Christianity and slavery are fine with each other, that there's not a problem there. Now, of course, not all people thought that. There were plenty of Christians who were opposed to slavery, but they have a harder argument to make. There's not a passage that you can pull out and say, here in the Bible it says don't have slaves. It doesn't exist. So you can't make it by pulling out a biblical passage. You have to make that argument by appealing to something else. So what do you appeal to? Well, for starters, if you look at the beginning of the relationship between the people Israel and the God Yahweh in the Bible, that relationship, the foundation of that relationship is Yahweh bringing those people out of slavery in Egypt. Right. Right. So you've got this whole foundation to the relationship that is based on a God who frees at least Israel from slavery. If you look at the 10 Commandments prefaced in Exodus, I am the Lord your God who brought you out, right? So this idea of liberation is firmly embedded in the text. And so that's where you get the other side of it, the ability to kind of use that same tradition that was used to enslave people and uphold that system. That same tradition is also a source of those fighting against it, and a source of freedom and liberation for those who are enslaved. You might say, well, why would they become Christian when it was used in this way? Because there's also this part of it that is, a force for liberation that was very appealing for them. So you can see that playing out during the period of slavery, and of course that continues through segregation as well, basing segregation again on the Bible. God created these different races. God set boundaries for them. They should keep separate. So you have religious justification really all throughout American history.
And I wonder if this is the moment for some students where they go, and maybe this is why we shouldn't have religion, right? This is why, because it's too problematic, because it's too divisive. Can you talk about that maybe as a way to how students have, I guess, not just students, let's just be honest here, how people, come to try to reconcile the divisive nature of religion in order to support oppression, social oppression.
Yeah, I mean, where I see frustration is students looking at the text and thinking you can make it say whatever you want. And that's where I think a lot of that frustration comes in.
Sure, that's that technical, the technical terms we use, right? So the eisegesis of the text, right? So pulling things from our own thoughts, the experiences we've had, we read that into the text.
Right.
Or to do exegesis, right? So allowing the text or interpreting the text by the text, which some would call circular reasoning. It does create some challenges, right? So that's kind of the Christian. So thinking about Christianity in the United States as it relates to race and race relations, do we see things shaping up differently with Judaism, and perhaps and then let's move, same question, and then for Islam.
Sure. So in Judaism, you basically get the same kinds of arguments, except the New Testament isn't playing a role.
That's right.
So in Christianity, you can pull from both the Old Testament and the New Testament to make arguments in favor of slavery, in favor of segregation. And those who countered slavery and segregation could also pull from both the Old Testament and the New Testament and what Jesus was all about. In Judaism, the argument then is really going to be focused on the Hebrew Bible, but you've got sort of some of the same arguments that are being made. So I've got a couple of sermons from the 1800s from Jewish rabbis, one arguing in support of slavery. Hey, the patriarchs who we hold up as moral models held slaves, right? So again, an easy argument to make. And on the other hand, a Jewish rabbi making a similar argument about the whole character of God being liberative. Is that a word? Liberative, I think. So in Judaism, I think we see some similar arguments being made. In Islam, the history of, even though Muslims have been in America since the first explorers came to this country, but still the numbers of Muslims in this country have been smaller, and so we don't quite have the same material to draw on to look back and really get a handle on arguments made for or against. But one of the things that I think might be interesting to think about for Islam is looking at Malcolm X's understanding of race relations and what he sees from Islam, right? So he starts out as Nation of Islam, a leader in Nation of Islam, so kind of an American-born version of Islam that at first doesn't really have much in common with what we know of Islam from more the national or the international stage. Mm-hmm. And Nation of Islam is very much kind of a separatist tradition. But then what happens is he travels and he goes and sees Muslims from all over the world, right? He goes on Hajj,
Yes.
he goes to Mecca, and he sees white Muslims and black Muslims and Middle Eastern Muslims, and they were all treating each other as, he would say, brothers, so say brothers and sisters, right, in the faith. And for him, that was really impactful. And he saw in Islam then this, that it was about this equality. So that's something that he really got out of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you know how much I like to reference James Cone.
Yes.
And, you know, Dr. Cone wrote this really he wrote many striking books, but I believe that you still use or at least reference the book on Malcolm and Martin.
Right.
Can you kind of walk us through maybe what he's proposing? And the reason that I'm bringing that up, and if you don't want to do it, I'll bring up what he proposes, because it is a striking, it's something really striking to think about, given the history and the trajectory of those two iconic civil rights leaders. And the reason I'm bringing that up is that it's within these two folks, these two people, that we do see, you know, race and religion centrally located. And then it's not just about thinking about race and religion. They're after a particular or a particular set of outcomes. So they're looking for societal change, which is as kind of the goal of the civil rights movement. Do you want to tackle that?
Sure. You know, Martin and Malcolm are often seen as these polar opposites, first of
Yes.
all, right? And of course, Martin Luther King's the good guy and Malcolm X is the bad guy, right? So that's often how they're kind of perceived. And so, you know, kids learn about Martin Luther King, they often don't really know anything about Malcolm X, except to kind of have some negative responses to even his name, because he's seen as sort of violent, even though he himself wasn't. Mm-hmm. And so they're seen kind of as polar opposites, and as they're looking for very different things. James Cone, in his book Martin and Malcolm, really kind of works through who they were, what's driving their understanding, how their religion is playing a role in how they understand what's going on in America with respect to race, and what they advocate for in that regard. And his argument is that it's not either or, it's both and, that we need both of them, and that they kind of were moving more together as you know, time went on than further apart. So to set them on opposite poles is really kind of a misunderstanding of who they were and how they evolved. We talked earlier about changing as one gets older and continuing to understand and respond. And if you really kind of read through their writings and look at their lives, they certainly changed throughout the 60s in terms of their understanding.
Sure. Yeah, and that's precisely the reason that I would reference it in some of my classes, to recognize that as iconic as these leaders were, there were social experiences that were, for lack of a better term, I'll say, problematizing kind of the trajectory of the civil rights movement, so to speak. And I'm gonna make this a bit more personable for those who may think this is perhaps too academic. So I think it's really crucial that we think about how and what and how and why we believe the things that we do, right? So the values that we hold, the beliefs and the systems that come with those beliefs, because the way that I often like to talk about this is that for lack of a better explanation that would take a bit more time, you know, values are simply the things that are most important to us. And those values then are commensurate, or they should be in agreement. We work really hard to make sure that they're in agreement with the things that we believe. And then we actually, just because of the way that the brain works, is we create systems in order to support those values and beliefs. And then when you pull human beings into that, so more than just the individual, we create the means by which those values and beliefs are propagated, the way that we support them. And in religion, and this is sociology of religion gets into this a bit, so the rituals that we have reinforce our values and our beliefs. It is a communal gathering where we reinforce what we believe, why we believe it. But what's really fascinating about the process is that we don't often think deeply about why we believe or even do the things that we do. And I'd say that that's probably where it's a bit more of perhaps a disconnect. So I would reflect on my childhood and how I was socialized through education. And granted, we're kind of talking around the process of education, because it certainly is a part of what happens within religious traditions, but it's also happening through our schools, right? And I remember as a young kid, the month of February would roll around, and that meant it was Black History Month. So I was very excited about that. But the people that we would talk about, or we would even read about, in our social studies textbooks and later in history, it was, Martin Luther King Jr., it was Harriet Tubman, and not in that order, Sojourner Truth, Madam C.J. Walker, maybe. But then as I got older, I recognized, especially as I started reading more broadly, there were some people who were really left out of that conversation. Malcolm X was one of them. Other leaders, especially thinking about the civil rights movement, Stokely Carmichael, and so the Black Power movement wasn't even a part of the conversation. And you and I have talked about this, I remember when I first read W.B. Du Bois's, the Souls of Black Folk. And when I read that book, I was like, why did I not realize this even existed? And that's because in the community in which I grew up in, Booker T. Washington was the one that we were familiarized with. Now, we're talking about two strains of values and beliefs about what is kind of the idea for where Black people should, or how Black people should kind of deal with their social surroundings. And I'll just give a brief overview of why this was so striking to me, because the pattern, or at least these realities, are not lost in our present day. So Booker T was really firm in his understanding that the role of Blacks is to, and I'm using that term to include all Black people, so not just African Americans, and that can be a whole nother conversation for a later time too, is to grow where they're planted, so to speak, so to be industrious. And when we think about some of the history connected to our historically Black colleges and universities that are A&Ms, or, so agricultural and mechanics, right? So the ability to work with one's hands, to be industrious. Well, W.B. Du Bois was not about that life. So as the young people say, right? He was about disrupting the system, because if one becomes too comfortable with their lot in life, there will never be an advancement. And so there are these conflicting views, and that carries forward. But the problem of what I just described is that if we truly understand education as a socializing agent, what that does for the mind of a young person is it really kind of shapes around what you were talking about earlier, where you've got one person who is, and their idea is villainized, and the other kind of this heroic figure. And then we can walk away thinking that one is, better than the other, to the exclusion of the other, right? So even if the other is not even included in the conversation, which is rather fascinating too. Mm-hmm. And let me share as a transition. So in the course, one of the courses that I would teach at the University of Evansville was race and ethnic relations. And in that course, my students would get to the point of where they would say, why is this the first time I have ever read this material, heard about this topic? And many times they would lament, I was a part of a really good high school. I was in an AP program for history, and we never talked about this.
Yeah.
Now, I've said a lot of things, but I wonder if you want to kind of riff off of some of that as it relates to whatever you like.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I've heard the same thing. Students that are just shocked that there's so much that they never knew because they've been getting the whitewashed version of it, right? Of history. What I think is interesting, so I would push even further we get this figure as opposed to that figure. Even look at how we get Martin Luther King.
That's true.
We don't really get Martin Luther King. We get, I have a dream. And only part of that speech even.
Yes.
Right? That my 4 little children will be judged by not by the color of their skin, but the content of their character. What about the part of that speech that talks about the bad check that America wrote because it's not living up
to its ideals?
Its ideals, exactly.
Right. Yeah.
We don't really, most people probably wouldn't recognize that part of the speech because we don't really teach it. We teach sort of the nice, easy for consumption, let's just treat everybody nicely, Martin Luther King, instead of the real critique he had of America and its failure to live up to its ideals.
Right.
And so much of his critiques resonate so strongly today. So when you read something like Letter from a Birmingham Jail, you could almost feel like you're reading something that was written last week instead of 50-ish years ago, right?
Yeah.
So, and if we kind of look back to that relationship of race and religion too, that letter, if anybody who's watching, if you have not read Letter from a Birmingham Jail, go and read it. It's online, easy to find.
Yes.
It is such a well-written piece and gets at the heart of so many of King's, I think, ideas. That's a letter every spring, whatever class I'm teaching, I usually assign that letter. We read it, either right after Martin Luther King Jr. Day. And I can connect that letter to any of the classes I teach.
Yes.
And almost every year, I'll sit down and write my syllabus and say, oh, I teach this all the time. Should I take it out? Maybe mix it up. And then I go back and look at it. It's like, no, I'm good. It's staying because it is so well done. But, if you go back and look at that letter, he really sees white Christians as one of the biggest stumbling blocks for racial equality. That's a pretty uncomfortable idea.
Right.
And it's one that doesn't get a lot of press. That's not the King that we teach.
Right.
In schools.
Yeah, I often say, Dr. King was an equal opportunity offender.
Yeah.
He didn't pull any punches, and the reason why I believe he didn't is because he did want us to live up to our ideals, and so as a nation, as a community of people interacting with each other. And all of that was immersed in the Christian tradition for him, right? Trained as a theologian himself, and an active pastor, the son of, he was a pastor's kid.
Right.
So it was out of that Christian, specifically the Christian tradition, that he really kind of gave voice. The other thing that's really striking to me, and this isn't really a talk specifically about Dr. King, but I think that it's really interesting that, when he was exploring ways to be able to address civil rights in the United States, I love where he considered the works of Karl Marx. And the reason that matters to me is that, as a social theorist, Karl Marx is really an important figure because even though he was not a sociologist, he did talk about economic systems. I feel like I say that on every one of our webinars. But he ultimately rejects Marx's kind of plan or for change in society. So this idea that it's kind of in this, it's an evolutionary process whereby you've got the bourgeoisie and you've got the proletariat. So you've got the people at the top, the haves, and you've got the have-nots at the bottom. And you can really kind of then split this any way you want, right? So when it comes to race, you've got the dominant racial group and you've got the subjugated racial group. And for Marx, what that would mean is that, as it's applied by folks like W.B. Du Bois and others, is that it would take time, but what would happen is that proletariat or that working class, the subjugated group, would overthrow the people at the top. And this is the classic Marxist. So I'm not talking neo-Marxism here. The difficulty with that for King was that it completely misses the role of even what in King's language was the oppression or the oppressor or being oppressed as well, right? It would overlook those things. It didn't for King. It didn't also arrive at any real clear solution. So the reason why I'm bringing that up now is that it was Dr. King really kind of examining the works of Mahatma Gandhi, right? And seeing how that played out in that social context, between Eastern Indians and the British, and it was in that. So now we're talking about the Hindu tradition, right? We're coming out of another religious tradition, and the way in which social conflicts are addressed, and then it plays out very differently in the American context, or similar ways, but a different context. And so I think that's really striking too, because there it is again, right? We've got several examples we can draw on here of where this is the case. Anything you want to add to that?
Well, you bring up Gandhi, who was also holding the British to be accountable to their professed ideals.
That's right.
And really using that to, force this change, and it makes me start thinking about kind of those movements and how they, what that strategy was and how that relates to some of the protesting that we're seeing today. Tension was a desired effect. We need that tension in order to propel us towards some kind of change. Otherwise, the status quo is just fine, right? So, if we look back on King, and now, you see similar things with Black Lives Matter protesting, having that reaction against people who are protesting is what made people pay attention and made people feel bad about what we were doing and wanting to change that. So it kind of needed to be there and in your face, instead of, well, why don't they just go over there where they're not going to bother anybody and protest? Because they're not going to bother anybody, and you kind of need to bother people.
Yes.
Or these protests to be successful, to get people to pay attention.
So we've said lots of things, and Liara, I wonder if you want to jump in here, and if you feel comfortable, if you want to help us address. Do we have any questions that are out there? I don't think there are any, but there is someone asking about your perspective.
Well, all the stuff that you guys have said, it's like really interesting, and I think I agree with like everything you guys said. But one thing is like kind of like stood out for me was like when we were talking about how for a lot of students we don't really typically like learn about African American history or history of civil rights movement. Like I know for me, I never really like learned about those figures. Like I always learned about Martin Luther King. Malcolm X was never really talked about because he was talking about more of a villain, like you said. We didn't learn about Carter G. Woodson, who was kind of like one of the founding people for Black History Month in general. So I had to kind of like at my school implement strategies for how we could learn about our history and be able to move forward as a school and be able to promote change within our schools. So I think that's just like really interesting how that's kind of like a normalized thing within society today. But I also had a question for Dr. Stein about the catechism part that you talked about regarding like slavery. Do you still think that those catechisms that you mentioned are like present in society? And if so, like how?
Oh, that's a good question.
Mm-hmm.
Not in those original forms, obviously, right? So I think people are surprised that they existed because they're not something that people are continually using. But here's how I think that we see maybe similar kinds of things is when I think we have support for the status quo coming out of churches. And I think we get that a lot because the status quo is problematic. The status quo is still oppressive. The status quo is still overwhelmingly one of white supremacy. And so if you're not pushing back against that, and catechisms are sort of upholding things the way they are, maybe even to the point of presenting things, race is not even relevant. Because that's another way that I think the churches have upheld white supremacy, is to say, oh, well, Christianity is about saving souls. It has nothing to do with those political issues. But if you don't stake a claim against something like that, then you're essentially upholding what is currently going on. So I guess my answer is not in that same way, but I think by upholding the status quo, it does have a similar kind of effect.
Thank you.
So I invite others. Questions or comments? We still have some time here, and it would be good to be able to hear from our audience. Questions or comments, or even, I guess, further complications.
A lot of complications.
Looks like there's a comment. Someone said, I learned a lot about growing awareness from W.M. Perry's model of intellectual development.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with Perry's model of intellectual development. I think she's added something else here too. You want to take that one too?
Yeah. She says strict binaries to complicate views. I am probably still too hesitant to invite this. I don't know the answers. Pedagogy.
Mm-hmm.
There is a question from the panelist section. How do you handle a student who expresses an overtly racist sentiment?
Mm. Did you get that one, Dr. Stein?
Oh, yeah, that's hard. And I don't have an easy answer for that. So much of it is contextual. I don't, one of the things is even talking about something being racist or not, or someone kind of expressing racist views or not. In my classes, I also spend a lot of time at the front end talking about racism and what it is and what it isn't, and how calling somebody racist, for example, isn't really helpful, because racists are bad and none of us are those, of course. And yet, how do we still have all this racism? So I try to kind of complicate their experience of, or their understanding of what racism is, and that it permeates our society, and that we're all socialized to have these particular views. And so, talking about that a little bit helps, so that we kind of understand that that we're brought along with so many of these views, even if we don't want them. They're really hard to push back against, right? So, for example, another kind of favorite story that I like to use in class, Tim Wise, who's an anti-racist white guy, and he's a scholar that talks about anti-racism. He tells this story and it might be from his White Like Me book, I'm not sure, where he was taking a flight somewhere in the Midwest. And you know how you get on the plane, or we used to get on the plane when we were allowed to go places. You get on the plane and you look over to the left, and there in the cockpit you could see the pilots. And he got on the plane one day and looked over, and there were two black guys sitting there, so two black pilots. And his first reaction was, we're gonna die. Why? Because we're socialized to think that if there's a black person there, why are they there? Oh, they're there because of affirmative action, rather than they're there because they're good pilots and they know what they're doing. So he had that reaction. He immediately recognized what it was and was able to kind of say, okay, I know what's happening, and of course I don't think that way. But he had the reaction. So even somebody who basically their whole, professional life is devoted to combating racism still has those thoughts and still struggles with, these biases that sometimes we don't even recognize. I guess that doesn't really say how you respond to it. Sometimes the other students respond to it, and sometimes it just depends on what it is as to, well, how can we understand this a little bit better? Where's this coming from, and what assumptions might be underlying it? But it really just depends so much on what the topic is.
Yeah, I'll jump in on this one too. And then there's a really good question on here about practical ways that we can do things. So I'll leave that one for Liara to ask us. But in response to that overtly, racist sentiment that can come to bear in some of our classes, usually what happens, at least for me, this is the case. When this would happen, it would occur once the students had really become comfortable with me. Because here's what I recognize, as a Black man in the role that I was in as a professor and now as the chief diversity officer, I recognize what my body brings to the space.
Sure.
So what I'm doing is I'm really trying to make the environment as comfortable as possible. And I'm going to say this, being a person with no hair on top of my head, so that people can let their hair down. This is an intentional pedagogical strategy. And the reason why it's so important is, yes, I do want my students to be comfortable, but it's when they get to that point, that's when things come out that we either, things are being said where there's no filter, so to speak. And to be honest with you, there are many times when I would do that intentionally, so filtered speech, in order to draw my students out, right? And I can give you a very good example of when this happened in an intro to sociology class. I want a student, we were having a class discussion, and it wasn't even specifically about race. But a student made a comment, and I did something like pause, and then I drew attention by doing something like this. I said, awkward moment, right? And because the students were all very comfortable in that setting, I didn't even have to wade in on that and talk about why it was uncomfortable. The students started to ask questions of the other students' comments. Now, what I was really intent on doing is, because I'm the one who has kind of co-created the environment for this to happen, I do want to make sure that when a student feels comfortable enough to share those things without a filter, that they're not kind of, I don't want them to get beat up so bad that they never do it again. So then I have to be the one to reinforce the boundaries, the rules of engagement, so that we can have a fruitful interaction instead of a destructive one. And here's the beautiful thing. It doesn't always end beautiful. I'm just going to say that. It's messy. And the next class session is always the challenge, right? Because I've seen this happen enough to where the student who perhaps said something or that was overtly racist, or that kind of sentiment was there, and it's been called out, so to speak, they don't come to class the next class session. And then so I've gotten to the point of where I intentionally reach out to that student, hey, let's get together and talk about what happened in class and why I think it's going to be really crucial that you step back into the classroom, because we need to work this out together. And maybe this is a good transition. Lyra, do you want to read that question that came up in the Q&A?
Yes. Is it possible to share any plans you might have to address these issues?
Would this be a good time to talk about our diversity certificate plans, do you think, or?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's in the planning stages. So yeah, go ahead and talk about that, and then we'll finish on that note.
Sure. So, you know, I think one of the challenges at UE, being the small school that we are, is that there are not a lot of opportunities for students to study these kinds of things. Of course, your office is sort of a whole other way that people can explore this, but in the classroom, you know, we're a little bit limited. We do have a race and ethnicity minor that's relatively new, that been around for what, 3-ish years or something like that.
Yes.
That is one path that students can take to explore these issues a little bit more. But Dr. Shelby and I have been working on a diversity certificate that we hope to see through curriculum over the next month or so, maybe, that would really focus students on kind of knowledge and action, right? Understanding more about diversity issues, and then being able to respond, to take action. So it would involve kind of both of those. So it's still in the planning stages, probably, you know, so don't know exactly how that's going to work out, but we hope that would be something both for our traditional students that they would be able to do, probably about 9 credit hours or so is what we're looking at now. And also hopefully people from the community who might be interested in their own diversity credentials might be interested in that as well.
Yes. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Valerie Stein, and for Lyra Carter. Thank you so much for joining us today. And for those of you who have taken the time to at least listen, to participate, I hope that you find this to be a fruitful endeavor. Next week, we will be having a conversation with Dr. Sujin Jung from the Public Health Department here at the University of Evansville. Really looking forward to a phenomenal conversation with her as we talk about, again, the intersection of race and public health. And there's lots of things to talk about as it relates to that. So until then, be well, be safe, and we look forward to you joining us next week. Thanks so much.
Bye, everyone.
One last thing I'll add, there has been lots of questions about, will this be made available later? And the answer is yes. The sessions are all recorded, and we're working on getting these posted on the website or the webpage for the Center for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. So be on the lookout for that. So the sessions will be available to anyone after that point. Thanks so much. Have a great week.